The unique things about the production that we're going to do is there are two arias that were cut after the premiere, and we're going to actually they don't exist in the orchestra parts, but we have the vocal score. So I've orchestrated the things, and we're going to do those two arias, which will be fun. So there's an aria for Wilfred the jailer, and for Meryl that are typically not done in the productions, and we'll add those in. So it'll be just like you would have heard it if you were at the initial premiere. I've done the work once before, which is why this is kind of fun. This is the first time I've ever done a Gilbert Sullivan twice. So I'm interested to do the work, to do it again. And Yeomen is not done very often. I'm excited to have a chance to do it again, to see what I would think about it the second time. Yeah, and it's neat to get the chance to do it with the Savoyards, which I think has a unique energy and is sort of in the Gilbert Sullivan spirit. Like it's neat to see Gilbert Sullivan performed by a community troupe that way, because it has a sort of energy that I think is required for Gilbert Sullivan. It has this, there's a real commitment to or a real belief in their humor or in their formula, and that's kind of what makes it a fun group to work with. Yeah, and that's important. I think from a music perspective, it's funny. It's tricky, I think, to do Gilbert Sullivan, because I think if you try to put the music too much, it's hard as a conductor to pull the music back. But in essence, that's almost what you have to do, I think, when you do Gilbert Sullivan. That there are moments when you have to pick your spots. It's so important that the audience get the text, I mean, in any opera, of course, but particularly in Gilbert Sullivan, where that's where all the punchlines are delivered. And that you really understand the musicians really understand and the singers really understand the humor they're trying to produce, because some of the jokes are so subtle. Yeah, and they fall. I mean, that's what makes them so clever. I mean, it almost becomes a parody of opera, in its own sense, and it's what's cool about that, or I guess which makes it really neat, is that they knew what was going to work, and part of their brilliance was that it's sort of it's like having a time capsule from the 19th century. I mean, it's amazing they had a formula that was brilliant and that worked, and part of that formula was understanding what a 19th century audience understood, and so they were able to really mimic. In essence, I mean, always at the end of the first act of romantic opera, Italian opera, that's how it ends with this. You know, you leave wanting to come back for the second act, and that's they of course they achieved that in a pretty remarkable way. Foreshadowing that all's not going to end well in this one, and that's also really neat how they're able to do that. Maybe that's just thinking about that now, maybe that's part of it. I mean, you know, the addition of the trombone certainly helps in that regard, which always is, brings sort of a darker color to the proceedings. And all Gilbert Sullivan, in essence, is parodying to some extent opera. And if it doesn't feel like an opera, that can fail pretty miserably. So I think. Having enough string players to really add some depth to the sound, and especially in this case when you add all the extra winds, you have to have enough to balance that. That's important, or it can sound kind of silly. It adds so much, because really, and that's another one of Sullivan's that he's so good at. The orchestra really sort of comments on what's going on the stage, so he's able to almost tell you at times how to feel just by the orchestration that he gives you.
Exactly.
And it's very helpful, I think, for an audience in the 21st century, because some of the jokes are subtle. We want to reproduce Gilbert Sullivan as close as we can to the way Gilbert Sullivan was produced when it was produced, but that's always a tricky thing, because we have 150 years of perspective now, basically, between that time, or a little over 100 years, I guess, and how we do that can be is always always a tricky balancing act, and it's one of the things that makes them so amazing. I think is that it's most artistic things that are this light in character don't tend to stick. So it's hard to produce something. It has to be really good, of pretty amazing quality, to last over 100 years when it's so relevant, really, to the day that it was produced. Thing about, and that's part of their brilliance. I'm saying, like, it's for art to become classical, for it to stick, there has to be a certain universality to it, or a certain quality that's above and beyond.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of 19th century operetta that didn't make it. That was probably very popular in the day, I'm sure,
right.
Just like today. But somehow Gilbert and Sullivan have a certain quality. There's a certain universality to its themes. That there's no question that are the humor that. I mean, of course, especially in today's time, we can look at, I mean, they're so good at poking fun at themselves. And sometimes in an attempt to freshen it up, as you say, you can kind of hurt it.
Yes.
And if you really find or look for what the composer and the librettist are trying to achieve, and try to achieve that, you almost always have a better success.
Yeah.
And especially in their case, because it is so. What they were writing was so fresh, I think, at the time. I mean, it was so inventive and so relevant to the world they were living in, that it's neat if we can reproduce that. One of the neat things about those extra arias, like, it's always fascinating to see, especially because they often did their work so, Sullivan at least did his work so quickly.
Yeah.
How they edited after the premiere is always fascinating to go back and see what they pulled and what they kept and why. Is always really neat to look at in any composer. It's so important, I think, that in this kind of production that there's a community behind it, and that's certainly the feeling you get with the Savoyards, that there's so many people who really care about it being done right. I mean, not just the musicians and the actors and everything else. It's there's really a pride in the community that the Savoyards exists in Madison, and it has kind of a unique place, I think, in the summers here and how and beyond now. It's exciting that's exciting to be a part of it. So. And it's also unique. I think it's kind of fun to do. Gilbert and Sullivan in music hall is a I can't imagine a better place to do it, because it's so quirky and it's so it's the perfect size and the perfect venue, I think, for Gilbert and Sullivan. Actually, it's a great thing for Gilbert and Sullivan because one of the tricks with Gilbert and Sullivan is that it can be very difficult to balance, because in order to get the text out, you have to have a singer that has a light enough voice that can patter, and you can't have an orchestra that's blaring over the top of that, or it's really not good, and so it helps sort of balance itself. And in a piece like Yeomen, that's one of the tricks to Yeomen. Like, we're talking about the size of the orchestra. You have to be very careful. You have to use that sparingly, because if you are not careful, you can really can become just the orchestra, which is that would defeat the purpose. Madison, and it's very, I think, hard to appreciate when you're living here, but it's really, I think, one of the most unique places in the country. For a place the size of Madison to have the amount of arts and the quality of arts in Atlanta and in Madison is really, I can't imagine there are many other places like it. It's really an amazing, especially musically. Maybe because this is what I focused on, but there's so much and of such a high quality in such a small area that there's. It's an amazing thing to have that focused of a community on the arts. I hope it's something that Madison never takes for granted, because it's such a, when you leave, you realize just how amazing that is. That's really great.